Hi everyone, just a heads up, this week's show does contain some discussion about suicide and self-harm, so you may want to skip this episode if that's a difficult topic for you. If you or anyone you know is struggling with self-harm, please see the description for a list of resources, including a 24-hour crisis line. Thank you, and now on with the episode. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Therapy by the Book, the show where we take your favorite fictional characters and ask the question, what would it be like if they came to therapy? My name is William Haddad, and our character client for this episode is FedEx employee Chuck Noland from Castaway. This is a movie and story that is actually very similar to our character client from last week, Mark Watney from The Martian. So for this episode, in addition to looking at Chuck's story and exploring therapy with him, I'm also going to be checking out a couple of the parallels and distinctions between him and Mark Watney, who was our character client previously. So to begin with, let's take a look at Chuck's background. At the start of his story, he is a true working man in every sense of the phrase. He himself says at one point, "We live and die by the clock." He works for FedEx, overseeing shipping and delivery, and we're introduced to him in Russia, actually, in Moscow, I believe, where he's demonstrating to a group of FedEx employees the importance of punctuality when he takes a delivery package, opens it up, and shows a watch that he himself shipped from the other side of the world, and had the stopwatch feature going to show that it's taken 87 hours to travel from where he shipped it to where it's arrived now. Amount of time that he actually beat it by in getting to Moscow in advance. So he's very much, this is unacceptable, ladies and gentlemen. Time is everything. We live and die by the clock. How can we speed this up? How can we be more efficient? So very much somebody who is married to his work, married to his calendar, and has very little time for anything outside of increasing workplace efficiency. We do see that he is in a relationship with a young grad student named Kelly, and although they have a good relationship and are, actually very close and connected in the scenes that we see them in early on, it's also shown that much of their relationship is defined by both of them having extremely busy schedules. Chuck arguably more so, but Kelly, clearly is at this point having a lot on her plate as well. So there's this one scene where the two of them are just going, item by item down their itineraries and trying to find a window that works for them both to connect in anticipation of Christmas, which is coming up soon. And Chuck has to get on a plane flight on Christmas Eve as part of his job. And so he's going to be unable to stick around in the short term with Kelly and her family. And this is where everything changes. On the plane flight, they encounter some turbulence out over the Pacific Ocean, and the plane ultimately malfunctions, breaks down, and is torn apart by the storm that they fly into. It crashes into the ocean, and Chuck is the only survivor of him and the 4 pilots who are on board the plane. He's the only one that makes it out. And when he wakes up, he's alone on a deserted island, and is forced from that point on to survive all alone. So Chuck is put in a situation where being somebody who is all about time and punctuality and precision, suddenly endless time is all he has. He's basically thrust into a situation where he's confronted by the very antithesis of his life's philosophy up till that point. So I want to diverge slightly now and take a look at some of the similarities and also distinctions between Chuck's situation on this deserted island and Mark Watney's situation on Mars from last episode. Now, unlike Mark, Chuck is on Earth, which means he's got a little more in terms of resources and a little less immediate danger. For instance, he's got ample water and oxygen. Even though it's an island, it does rain a good deal, and there's drinking water. There's fresh water supplies on the island that he discovers as he explores. There's no risk of him dying from implosion or asphyxiation. He's not going to run out of oxygen. He doesn't have to be constantly monitoring his environment for mechanical malfunctions or electrical failure or anything like that. On the other hand, though, the big and probably the biggest difference between the two of them is that despite being so many millions of miles away from Earth, Mark actually has the means to contact people. He's not able to in the beginning, if you remember from last episode. It takes him some time before he's able to do that. But eventually he does reestablish contact with NASA. And even though it's indirect and on quite a time delay, it is, at the end of the day, still communication, support, and connection with other people. Chuck does not have any of that. He's on an island on Earth, but the isolation is more severe. And I think we see, looking at the difference between these two stories, really what a difference that makes. Chuck has literally no one to talk to. And ultimately, he ends up turning to Wilson, a volleyball that washes up on shore in one of the many FedEx packages that the plane was carrying. And many of these contain resources that Chuck ends up turning to his advantage to survive, some of which are very helpful and some of which are all but useless. But one of these packages contains a volleyball, which Chuck dubs Wilson after the brand. And Wilson ends up becoming his best friend for the 4 years that he ultimately lives and struggles to stay alive. So one might say Chuck arguably has more resources for survival, but less training, while Mark has top-tier training and equipment, even if his conditions are a little harsher. Mark, as an astronaut, has got some of the best training available from NASA. He knows how to respond to dangerous situations. He wasn't necessarily prepared for what happened to him on Mars, but he had a lot of built-in support and management skills to be able to respond when such an emergency hit. And again, he had a lot of extra help come in from NASA once he was able to reestablish contact with them. While Chuck has none of that, and even though he has, maybe a safer situation because the isolation is more severe, it's ultimately, I think, a lot harder on him emotionally to be able to use and figure out the resources he has to get by. We learn early on, even before the crash, that Chuck's greatest strengths are his organizational skills and knowledge of mathematics, which is what makes him so finicky about time management. But it also proves a blessing when he ends up plane wrecked on the island in order to keep track of time and resources. He eventually develops a custom sundial and figures out a way to use the sun and the light to track not only the time of day, but also the month and the season, which is a really important way to help keep perspective and, in part, one's sanity when you're in a situation like this. I will say, just speaking from personal experience, when I was a college student, my junior year, I went on a study abroad program called Semester at Sea, where we studied on a cruise ship that traveled around the world for about 3.5 months. It was essentially a floating college campus where we took classes and then explored the countries that we were learning about aboard ship in our classes. So amazing experience. But one of the things that really stood out to me and continues to this day was how very easily the concept of days of the week and even time of day can disappear from your consciousness if you're not constantly exposed to all the reminders that reinforce that structure. On the ship, to give you a little more detail, on the ship we had a system called A days and B days, which were how our classes were defined, and time was measured not in weeks, but in just how many days between ports it took for the ship to travel from place to place. So with that, very different style of looking at the passing of time, very quickly, my sense of what day of the week it was, Monday, Friday, Thursday, it just disappeared almost overnight. And before long, unless you showed me a calendar of the month and the date, I could not have told you what day of the week it was offhand, which I know sounds a little crazy to anybody who hasn't been in that situation, but it's real. And this was on a ship with a lot of internal structure and a lot of other people, 600 people around me to talk to. So imagine now what this is like for Chuck, being completely alone on this island with none of our modern conveniences to help him keep track of the time. It's honestly pretty extraordinary that he has the wherewithal at his disposal to even come up with a way to still keep track of time that much, and thus maintain some semblance of a broader horizon in his mind than just what's around his immediate surroundings. Another strength of Chuck's that we see are his organizational skills, which allow him, in addition to time, to keeping track of resources, knowing what is what, how much of something he needs, and what is reasonable. Some of this comes with practice as he continues to explore and learn how to adapt to his surroundings. But some of it, too, does, I think, come from his role as the supervisor and manager position at FedEx, where he likely had to see oversee a lot of different variables in the many transactions and traveling and shipping deals that took place. But apart from these two strengths that he arrives on the island already possessing, the rest is really a lot of trial and error as to whether or not he survives. We see it takes him several days before he finally learns how to start a fire, for instance, and he is simply jubilant when he finally pulls it off. And in the end, it is ultimately chance, which is what allows Chuck to escape the island. As he later recounts to a friend of his, this is well after he's finally gotten off the island and back to civilization, he recounts that at one point he became so lost and convinced that he would never get off the island that he actually tried to end his life. He went up to a high point on the island to set up a rope that was made of vine, but being his meticulous self, he had to test it first. So he tested the rope with a stone, and the rope snapped. And in that moment, he felt the last little sense of control he had over his fate leave him. He couldn't even control his life to the point of ending it. That was how completely helpless his situation had become. It really, I think, hammers home the emotional toll and the crushing weight and burden of the terrible isolation that he deals with while he's on that island. It's a very powerful scene, and something that I think can speak to all of us, anybody certainly who's ever felt lonely or struggled with isolation in their own right, whatever their circumstances. One of the reasons that some people do struggle with suicidal ideation, it isn't always about simply wanting to kill themselves because they want to be dead. Sometimes it's about feeling that their situation is just so hopeless that ending their life is the last little way of re-exerting control over an otherwise just terrible existence, which I know may seem contradictory to us, who have good lives or who could never conceive of doing that. But that really is, the nature of trauma. As we've talked about in earlier episodes, trauma is all about a loss of control. And I mean, no question, Chuck's situation is a traumatic one. So when you're confronted with the helplessness of your trauma on all sides, it's not unreasonable that the final gamble, the last logical conclusion would be to re-exert control by ending one's life in order to be free of that trauma. But as we see with Chuck, even that fails. Even that doesn't work out for him. And then, unexpectedly, something new happens. Something changes about him. He says to his friend, in that moment of complete and utter surrender to his situation, he feels new perspective and new motivation. As he puts it, I realized I had to keep breathing despite everything and keep hoping that he would be able to see Kelly again. You see, all this time on the island, he's also held on to the hope and the notion, just the idea that if he is able to get off the island, he'll be able to see Kelly again, to come back to the woman he loves. And that love, her love, is also part of what keeps his spirit intact. And in some respects is what helps him bounce back a little after the failure to end it all. We see that before he goes on the plane, he takes with him a little pocket watch that has a photo of her inside. And as he tells her, he sets the watch to Kelly time, or Memphis time, which is where she lives, so that wherever he is, he'll always have a little reminder of where she's at that's going with him. And as the days turn into years on the island, he also starts to draw pictures of her on the cave wall where he makes his island home. So there's a lot of her that comes with him as well to the island and ends up being a very strong coping tool and really survival mechanism, I think is a better word for it, survival skill that he turns to stay alive. And the chance that finally comes, the chance that allows him to at last escape the island, is a quote-unquote sail that washes up 4 years after he is stranded. It defies all logic, as he put it. There was nothing to suggest that he was ever going to get off the island. And yet by keeping that motivation, keeping that reason to breathe alive, he was able to stay alive long enough for the means to escape to finally arrive. But then, when he does finally get home, it's only to discover that everything has changed. Kelly is actually married now to someone else. She has a child. Other people have gone out of his life as well. The wife of one of his friends has died. And there's a lot to question and reflect on. As we see in the final scenes of the story, Chuck he's reflecting on a lot. He's realizing that both, the man that he is now is nothing like the man he used to be. And in a way, the man he used to be really did die. He really was buried and mourned, as everyone, after he disappeared, thought was actually the case. And what he's come back to now is a world that, is glad to see him, but also can never be like the one that he left behind. And yet, in spite of all the changes, in spite of not being able to be with Kelly anymore, despite, not being able to just go back to the way that things used to be, Chuck states that he still believes in the same sentiment that allowed him to survive long enough on the island for the means of change to come then. As he puts it, I know I've quoted a lot, but this has a lot of great quotes. Who knows what the tide could bring in? So coming now to diagnosis, he's been through trauma, no question. But I hesitate to say that it's complex PTSD. Why is that? Well, despite everything that he goes through on the island, he's not actually displaying a lot of the clinical symptoms or criteria of somebody still actively in the thralls of PTSD, at the end of the story, at least. He's, for instance, not avoidant of planes. We see him flying on a plane after he escapes and recovers, and is going back to civilization. And he's fine. He's calm. He's easygoing, which is pretty extraordinary, actually, considering how horrific the last plane flight he was on before that was. But we know that he hasn't succumbed to the need for avoidance, even though there's change, even though Kelly's life is different and their life is different. He doesn't shy away from trying to still speak to her and talk with her and have closure with her. We also see that he's not struggling with, too many physical symptoms. If anything, he's in better shape thanks to the hardiness of the lifestyle he had to cultivate on the island. He's actually much fitter. He's lost weight. He's much healthier physically than he was prior. So there's really not a lot that we can point to in terms of direct clinical criteria, I think, for PTSD. Although his situation was traumatic, and although you could argue that it is a complex trauma, even though it is one specific event, it ended up transforming him and everything about his life and his philosophy and his value set. That I think that, in itself makes it a complex traumatic experience. I also think that it's not fair to give him a label that he's still struggling from PTSD at the end. So as his therapist, if he's, going to be seeing me through insurance or whatnot, I don't know what FedEx's health plan is in terms of their provider, but for a diagnosis, if I needed to give him one, I would go light. I think other specified trauma and stressor-related disorder makes the most sense because it does define his situation. It was traumatic, but he's not really, meeting out the criteria in the dot the I's and cross the T's sense. As for treatment, well, this would also be, I think, a little interesting, and maybe not what you would expect offhand if you're familiar with people who've been through trauma and sought therapy for it. I think that a balanced approach, actually, between talk therapy and art therapy might be my go-to. Because when he was on the island, he talked. He talked to Wilson, he talked to himself plenty. But a lot of how he's learned to navigate and understand himself and grow and change has been done more, at least during his time on the island, through hands-on experiences. So I think art therapy, sand tray, building, any kind of therapy that involves a physical, hands-on interaction with something would be maybe, if not a good starting point, then a good long-term approach with some talk therapy interwoven in. We see that he got very artistic on the island, as I mentioned earlier, drawing pictures of Kelly, creating Wilson as his best friend. A lot of other things that he added to give his island dwelling a bit of an aesthetic flair, creating perhaps a trauma narrative that is visual rather than verbal or written, using art to give clear definition or a clear sense of his feelings now that he's back and he's having to recreate his life all over again, really for the third time, because he had to change it once on the island and now he has to change it again now that he's off the island. So a lot of that, a lot of emotional reflection, definitely a lot of affirmation of the lengths that he went to survive, and affirmation of his own change as a person. And validation. In addition to that, validation of mixed feelings that he has about both grieving how Kelly has moved on with her life, and yet at the same time feeling grateful that she helped him through the worst periods on the island. It's a very confusing situation to be in, I think, when you can feel such deep love and gratitude towards someone while at the same time feeling sad, maybe even angry or bitter that they can no longer continue to be that for you going forward. It's one of the things that we've talked about on the show and that I think can never be overstated when speaking of people and of humanity in the general sense, is that emotionally we're gray. We're more capable of feeling different emotions, mixed feelings simultaneously that on paper would appear to contradict one another. But it is possible for us to feel grief and gratitude, love and anger, sadness and joy about the same thing simultaneously. And Chuck demonstrates this quite powerfully as he's reflecting on everything that he's been through. And I would certainly want that to be a component of our sessions together as well. Asking him to define his feelings verbally, or asking him to maybe demonstrate what they are like in the abstract sense on a painting or a sketch. Creating that narrative through visual representation sometimes can be a better solution than talk therapy, because we don't always have the right words, or even if we do have the right words, they don't always feel sufficient to describe the emotional weight of the feelings that we are trying to articulate about our trauma. On top of that, I would have our therapy be a lot about exploring new life goals and purpose. He's left behind one legacy now when he departed, when he ended up on the island the first time, the legacy of the working man who was all about material value and time and punctuality. Now he's back. He's a different man. He's a changed man in a changed world. What different legacy does he want to build? Does he even want a new legacy? Is there a way that he can reapply himself to something that he hasn't considered before, a different way of existence that maybe he's never considered? This could range from anything, from the survival skills. They could be put towards teaching others how to survive. They could be put towards new ways to simply live in the daily sense. Everything from woodwork to gardening to crop cultivation. There's a lot of I think different options available. But the key thing is that none of this should feel forced upon him because of everything he's been through. I think that just allowing him the space to reflect first and foremost, and really not have any kind of hard set agenda. Because he knows, even if he may not be ready to admit it yet, that he's never going to go back to the way he was. Just as he knows that the relationships he had before can never be brought back, can never return to the way they used to be. He also is never going to be able to go back to the man he was in terms of the lifestyle he lived or the habits he kept. And that's okay. It's more than okay that this change is permanent. But it will be important for him to feel like he has the freedom and the space to accept that truth at his own pace. And I think, too, possibly some social reintegration work. Although, again, he was, just because he was alone for 4 years doesn't mean we now have to double down on getting him ready to, going up and speaking in front of crowds like he was at the beginning of the story. Just because it's how you used to be doesn't mean that you need to become one of them in that sense again. If he comes to the conclusion that he's meant now, even though he was alone for so long and hated it, that he actually prefers a more quiet life, one where there aren't as many people around in his day-to-day. That may be the new answer, and that's one that, as his therapist, I would do my best, I would want to do my best to support and validate as well. Because I think that despite everything that he endured, the takeaway that he brought away from it all is a really beautiful one and worth cherishing. And that's the message that ultimately I would strive to help him recognize. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you all next time on Therapy by the Book.